The air in the Apex boardroom was so cold it felt like a tomb. I stood in the back, invisible. My director, Mark, was at the front, basking in the glow of the projector. My projector. My slides. My work. Project Titan is the key to our European expansion, he announced, his voice smooth as polished marble. The partners from corporate headquarters leaned forward, captivated. He was selling them my strategy, my late nights, my soul, all for a partnership role he didn't deserve. He clicked to the next slide, a confident smirk on his face. He thought he was untouchable. He didn't see what I saw, a faint, almost subliminal pattern in the background. My digital signature. My name. David Chen. On everything. For 6 years at Apex Strategy, I was Mark's ghost. David Chen, 38, the guy he'd call his secret weapon over drinks, but just an analyst on the org chart. I was the engine. He was the polished hood ornament. I built the models, crunched the data, and pulled the all-nighters. He took the credit. I accepted it as the price of climbing the corporate ladder. I told myself my time would come, but Project Titan was my masterpiece. A year of my life, my shot at recognition, distilled into a 60-slide deck that would redefine our firm's global footprint. 2 weeks ago, he'd called me into his office, the Chicago skyline gleaming behind him. "David, this is solid support work," he'd said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "But you're not quite partner material. I'll need to present this myself to give it the best chance." That was it. The moment the polite theft became a brazen heist. He wasn't just taking credit for a project. He was trying to execute my career. That night, fueled by coffee and quiet fury, I went back into the file. I wasn't going to be a ghost anymore. I was going to be a watermark. The pattern started 4 years ago with the Kensington deal. I was hungry, naive, still believing that hard work was its own reward. I built a valuation model from scratch, a beautiful, intricate piece of logic that identified the buyout target everyone else had overlooked. Mark presented it to the executive team. My name was nowhere on it. When I brought it up in his office later, he leaned back in his leather chair, a picture of calm condescension. "David, it's about presenting a unified front. It looks better coming from a director. We're a team. Your time will come, I'll make sure of it." I was 34. I wanted to believe him, so I nodded and went back to my desk. A year later, the team sent me to Des Moines for 3 months to handle the Omnicorp restructure. My hotel room smelled of stale air freshener and regret. I lived on lukewarm coffee and takeout, sleeping in 4-hour bursts, my world shrinking to the glow of my laptop screen. I found it on a Tuesday at 3 a.m., a recurring accounting error, buried deep in their logistics chain, bleeding them of millions a year. I saved them. The congratulatory email from the Omnicorp CEO praised Mark's unparalleled analytical mind. Mark got a promotion to senior director. At the celebration party, he slung an arm around me, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "To my secret weapon," he bellowed, raising his glass. It wasn't a compliment. It was a branding iron. He was marking me as his property. But Project Titan was different. This wasn't a model I built on command. This was a vision I conceived from nothing. It came to me on a sleepless Saturday night, poring over geopolitical forecasts and European trade journals just because I was curious. The key wasn't in London or Paris. It was a mid-sized, family-owned logistics firm in Hamburg, Germany, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Everyone saw a liability. I saw a perfectly positioned Trojan horse. It was elegant. It was audacious. It was I, mine. That's why his words cut so deep. You're not quite partner material. He delivered the line with the casual cruelty of a man swatting a fly. He wasn't just stealing this project. He was trying to define my entire career, to lock me into the role of his brilliant invisible ghost forever. He saw Titan as his legacy, his ticket to the corner office with the panoramic view. He just saw me as the fuel to get him there. He assumed I'd stand in the back and applaud, just like I always had. He never once considered that the man who designs the engine also knows exactly where to place the kill switch. I walked back to my cubicle that evening in a daze. The city lights of Chicago blurred into streaks of indifferent gold. Not partner material. The words echoed, stripping away 6 years of loyalty in a single sentence. It wasn't just an insult. It was a cage. He was locking me in. I sat in my chair, the silence of the empty office pressing in, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. It was the end of the ghost. That night, I didn't go home. I brewed a pot of coffee that was thick enough to stand a spoon in and opened the Project Titan file. 60 slides. My life's work. I navigated to the slide master, the template that governed the look of the entire presentation. This was the source code of his deception. It would become the source code of mine. I created a new text box. Font, Apex Sans. Size, 96 point. Bold. I typed my name, David Chen. Then, a title I'd never been given, Lead Strategist. It looked monstrous, shouting from the screen. Then, I began to dial it back. I opened the transparency settings. 90%, 80%, still too visible. I kept going, clicking down, percent by percent. At 97% transparent, it almost vanished. Almost. It became a whisper. A faint, geometric pattern hidden in the negative space of our corporate blue background. It was invisible if you weren't looking for it, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. It was on every slide, woven into the very DNA of the presentation. Behind every chart, under every bullet point, my name was there, a silent, screaming testament. I saved it as backquote, Titan_final_V2, PPTX, backquote. The kill switch was set. The next morning, Mark strolled over to my desk, holding a porcelain mug of coffee. He looked fresh, rested. He probably slept like a baby. "Morning, Dave. Got that final deck for me? The partners are flying in tomorrow." He didn't even make eye contact, already looking past me toward his future. I took a slow breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. The point of no return. I kept my face a perfect mask of professional deference. "Of course, Mark. I made a few final tweaks to the data visualizations last night, just to make them pop." "Good man," he said, the praise as hollow as a drum. "Send it over. I want to run through it a few times before the big show." I attached the file and hit send. The email left my outbox with a soft, digital whoosh that sounded like a guillotine dropping. From my desk, I watched him open it on his laptop. He clicked through the first 10 slides, his head nodding in approval. He was looking at the content, the substance. He was so focused on the message, his message, that he never even glanced at the medium. He was a thief admiring the jewels, completely oblivious to the silent alarm he'd just tripped. He closed the file, gave me a curt nod, and walked back to his office, my masterpiece tucked under his arm like a trophy. He had no idea he was carrying a bomb, and I was the one with my finger on the detonator. I stood by the mahogany credenza, a ghost at my own funeral, and felt an unnerving calm settle over me. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I had already done the work, set the trap. Now, all I could do was watch. Mark was in his element, a predator on the hunt. He gestured at a market penetration chart, my chart, and spoke of aggressive Q4 targets, with a conviction that was almost believable. The 3 partners from corporate, Mr. Sterling, the stoic CFO, Ms. Hayes, the razor-sharp chief strategy officer, and Mr. Thorne, the old guard CEO, were captivated. They nodded, scribbled notes. They were buying the performance, and for a terrifying moment, I wondered if I'd been too clever, too subtle. Mark clicked to slide 22, Synergistic Acquisition Pathways, a dense, data-heavy slide that I knew he didn't fully understand. He'd memorized the talking points, but not the soul behind them. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of the information sink in, and in that silence, I saw it. The first flicker of doubt. It came from Miss Hayes. She sat at the head of the table, her posture impeccable. She tilted her head slightly, like a hawk spotting a field mouse from 1,000 feet up. Her eyes narrowed, not at Mark, but at the blank blue space on the upper right corner of the slide. She leaned forward, a barely perceptible motion, and squinted. The faint pattern of the watermark was catching the light in a peculiar way, a ghostly grid of text masquerading as a design flourish. She saw something. She didn't speak. She just held her gaze on the screen as Mark, completely oblivious, launched into his next point. The logistical integration will be seamless, he was saying, but his voice was starting to fade into background noise. Across the table, Mr. Sterling noticed Hayes's intense focus. He followed her line of sight to the screen, his own brow furrowing in concentration. A silent question passed between them. Mark clicked again. Slide 23. A different layout. Different charts, but the same subliminal signature woven into the fabric of the background. David Chen. Lead strategist. Hayes slowly reached for the tablet in front of her, her movements deliberate. She tapped the screen, pinching and zooming on the live feed of the presentation. Her expression remained a perfect corporate poker face, but I saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. She knew. Mark, high on his own performance, beamed. Any questions so far? The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Ms. Hayes lowered her tablet, her gaze lifting from the screen and landing, for the first time, directly on me. Her eyes held no accusation, no anger, just cold, calculating curiosity. She knew who designed the engine. And she was about to ask the driver why my name was on the ignition. Ms. Hayes broke the silence. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a laser. I do have a question, Mark. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were still locked on me, standing in the back of the room, a silent acknowledgement. A summons. Mark puffed out his chest, preening. Of course, Elizabeth, please. It's about the design, she said, her tone deceptively casual. The slide template. There's a subtle geometric pattern in the background. It's on every slide. An unusual choice. What was the design philosophy behind it? It was the perfect question. A landmine disguised as a compliment. Mark blinked. For the first time that morning, his smooth facade cracked. I could see the gears grinding in his head, searching for an answer to a question he never knew existed. The pattern? He stammered, turning to squint at the screen behind him. Ah, yes. That's just the new Apex branding. A subconscious signifier of our interconnected, global strategy. Synergy. He threw out the last word like a life raft. Ms. Hayes didn't smile. That's not our new branding, Mark. I approved the new branding guidelines myself last month. This is something else. She turned to the A/versus tech in the corner. Could you increase the projector's contrast by about 15%, please? And dim the lights a little more. The room plunged into near darkness, the screen flaring with brilliant blue light. And there it was. No longer a ghost, no longer a whisper. The increased contrast made the letters pop, turning the faint pattern into a legible, repeating grid. David Chen. Lead strategist. David Chen. Lead strategist. It was everywhere. My name, plastered over my work like an undeniable proof of ownership. A collective gasp went through the room. Mr. Sterling, the CFO, slowly took off his glasses and polished them, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mr. Thorne, the CEO, leaned forward, his face a thundercloud. Mark turned. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly ajar. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of horror. He looked from the screen to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. The thief, standing in the art gallery, suddenly realizing every painting is signed by the security guard he just passed in the hall. His composure shattered. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is him. Chen. He must have sabotaged the file. This is insubordination of the highest order." The room was a powder keg, and Mark had just lit the fuse. This was the moment I'd played over in my head 1,000 times. The moment where he would try to turn me from a ghost into a scapegoat. I had a choice. I could let the chaos consume him, or I could seize control. I chose control. I took a deliberate step forward, my shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. All eyes swung to me. I wasn't the ghost in the corner anymore. I was the center of gravity. "I can explain that, Miss Hayes," I said, my voice perfectly level. I directed my answer to her, and only her. In that room, she was the only one who mattered. Mark was already irrelevant. The watermark, I continued, is a digital signature I embed in all my preliminary drafts. It's a version control measure to ensure that unfinished strategic models aren't mistaken for final, board-approved deliverables. I paused, letting the implication land. I'm surprised it's still on this version. Mark was supposed to use the finalized, clean file I sent him for the official presentation. It was a lie, of course. A beautiful, elegant, corporate-sounding lie. It reframed my act of sabotage as a standard professional procedure, and Mark's theft as gross incompetence. It suggested he was so careless he couldn't even use the right file. Mark's jaw worked silently. He was cornered. If he admitted he never received a final file, he'd be admitting he stole my draft. If he claimed this was the final file, he'd be admitting he was either too lazy or too stupid to remove a watermark before presenting to the CEO. He had no move left. Ms. Hayes's expression was unreadable, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Respect. She had laid the trap, and I had not only sprung it, but I had also dictated the terms of the enemy's surrender. So, to be clear, Mr. Chen, she said, her voice like ice, Project Titan is your work? Yes, I said, from initial conception to the final 60-slide deck. She turned her steely gaze back to Mark, who seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. Mark, on slide 22 you mentioned synergistic acquisition pathways. The third-quarter projection for the Hamburg logistics integration seems optimistic. It doesn't account for the new German LKSG regulations. Explain the discrepancy. Mark stared at her, utterly blank. He didn't even know what LKSG stood for. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. He had memorized the script, but he didn't know the language. Ms. Hayes didn't wait for an answer. She looked back at me. Mr. Chen? I didn't hesitate. The model does account for it, I said, stepping forward. The projection isn't based on Q3 cargo volume, which is what Mark was looking at. It's based on a predictive analysis of the shift in supply chain contracts away from non-compliant carriers, which we'd absorb. The LKSG regulations are not a risk. They're the entire strategic opportunity. We're not just buying a company, we're buying their imminent market share. Silence. I had just effortlessly articulated the core of my entire strategy, the very soul of the project. I hadn't just built the engine, I had designed it down to the last bolt. Mr. Sterling let out a low whistle. Mr. Thorne, the CEO, finally spoke. His voice, a low rumble that filled the room. Mark, he said, not looking at his director, get out. Mark stood frozen for a second, a statue of disbelief. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the boardroom, his career dissolving behind him with every step. The door clicked shut, leaving an echoing silence. The presentation, my presentation, was still glowing on the screen, my name faintly visible 100 times over. Ms. Hayes looked at me, then gestured toward the front of the room. Mr. Chen, she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Please, continue. I walked to the head of the table, my footsteps echoing in the sudden cathedral silence. Mark's clicker lay on the polished wood where he'd dropped it. I picked it up. It felt like a scepter. I turned to face the three most powerful people in my company, their gazes a physical weight. They weren't just watching a presentation anymore. They were conducting an audit of a man's soul. I clicked to the next slide. My slide. The LKSG regulations aren't a hurdle, I said, my voice resonating with an authority I didn't know I possessed. They're a battering ram, and we're about to knock down the door. For the next 20 minutes, I wasn't David Chen, senior analyst. I was the architect of Project Titan. The words flowed not from memory, but from conviction. I didn't just present the data, I told its story. I explained the geopolitical nuances, the subtle shifts in German labor law, the precise financial modeling that made this audacious plan not just possible, but inevitable. I moved through the slides with an effortless command that Mark, with his memorized talking points, could never have faked. When a question came from Mr. Sterling about currency hedging, I didn't just give him the answer. I walked him through the 3 alternate scenarios I'd already modeled and explained why my primary recommendation was the only one that insulated us from market volatility. I saw him exchange a look with Ms. Hayes, a quick, affirmative nod. It was the look of a puzzle piece clicking into place. They weren't just seeing a competent analyst. They were seeing a strategist, a partner. When I reached the final slide, a simple, bold projection of our new European market share in 3 years, I didn't need to add any flourish. The numbers spoke for themselves. I lowered the clicker and met their eyes in the quiet, dimly lit room. "That," I said, "is Project Titan." Mr. Thorne, the CEO, leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Chen," he began, his voice a low gravel, "you put your name on the slides." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "I signed my work," I replied simply. There was no defiance in my tone, just ownership. Ms. Hayes allowed herself a small, sharp smile. "And you let him walk right into it." "He was so focused on the destination," I said, "he never thought to check the map." Thorne grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh. He stood up, a towering figure who commanded the space around him, and walked to the panoramic window overlooking the Chicago River. "Mark was a good salesman," he said, his back to me. "But you don't sell a strategy like this. You build it. From the ground up." He wanted the glory of cutting the ribbon on a skyscraper he didn't have the blueprint for. He turned back, his eyes drilling into me. "The partnership role Mark was being considered for comes with a significant portfolio. It requires vision, precision, and frankly, a certain ruthlessness. You seem to have all 3. My heart hammered in my chest, but I held his gaze. This was it, the culmination of everything. "The partnership committee meets next week," Thorne continued. "But Elizabeth, Richard, and I are the committee. We're in agreement. The role is yours, if you want it." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding since Mark first called me into his office. 6 years of being a ghost, 6 years of being a secret weapon, erased in a single moment. I hadn't just gotten credit for my work, I had taken his future. "I want it," I said. "Good," Thorne said with a curt nod. "Your office will be on this floor. Have HR work out the details with my assistant. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to discuss how we're going to fast-track this." As I walked out of the boardroom, the air felt different, lighter. I passed Mark's old office. The door was ajar. Inside, a junior HR representative was watching him dump the contents of his desk into a cardboard box. A framed photo of his family went in face down. He looked up and our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw no hatred, no anger, just a hollow, empty shock. He was the ghost now. A man who had ceased to exist at Apex. I didn't slow down. I walked past, down the hall, and into the office that would now be mine, the one right next to the CEO. The view of the Chicago skyline was spectacular. It was the same view Mark had when he told me I wasn't partner material. He was right. I wasn't. I was so much more. The new office smelled of fresh paint and possibility. It was cavernous and sterile, the blank canvas. Mark never got to spoil. I stood by the window, the same view he'd had, but it looked different from this side of the glass. The city felt less like an indifferent backdrop, and more like a territory map waiting to be claimed. A sharp knock on the doorframe broke my reverie. It was Ms. Hayes, Elizabeth. She leaned against it, holding a thin file, her expression just as analytical as it was in the boardroom. "Settling in?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "It's a change of scenery," I replied. She walked in, her heels making soft, deliberate clicks on the polished floor. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze direct and unnerving. "The watermark, David. It was an incredible risk. What if none of us had noticed?" I met her eyes without flinching. The question deserved an honest answer. Then I would have known this wasn't a place where the details mattered. It wasn't just a trap for him, Elizabeth. It was a test for Apex. If the leadership couldn't see the truth written plainly in front of them, then I would have taken my work somewhere that could. A genuine, sharp smile finally broke through her composure. That's what I told Thorne. She extended the file to me. You need to understand something. Mark wasn't fired for the theft. Plagiarism is distasteful, but in this town, it's practically a sport. He was fired for the incompetence. He held your masterpiece in his hands and couldn't answer a single question about how it worked. He was a driver who didn't know how to open the hood of the car he was trying to sell. She tapped the file in my hand. He saw a trophy. You built an engine. That's the difference between a salesman and a partner. At this level, ignorance isn't just a weakness. It's a terminal disease. I opened the file. It was the official Project Titan charter. My name was at the top. David Chen, lead partner. The moral victory was sweeter than the revenge. My success wasn't defined by his failure, but by the undeniable quality of my work. The watermark hadn't been the weapon. The work itself was. The watermark was just the targeting system. Thorne wants the Hamburg team briefed by Friday, she said, turning to leave. Welcome to the partnership, David. Try not to make a habit of embedding your resume into your presentations. Her parting shot was dry, but her eyes held a spark of shared conspiracy. Has a boss ever tried to take credit for your work? Tell me about how you handled it in the comments below.